Hey guys, welcome back to the Barney Homestead. We are in the kitchen today and I'm going to be showing you how I make sourdough bread from start to finish. This is probably the most requested video I get over on my Instagram. So I figured it was just time to go ahead and make this video. So a couple things you're going to need before you get started. If you're making sourdough bread, you're of course going to need your sourdough starter. This is kind of the magic piece that makes sourdough work. So I fed my starter last night before I went to bed. It's been about 10 hours and now it is at peak activity. The other thing you're going to need, of course, is a mixing bowl. You are going to need a digital scale, filtered water. Let's see what else I got. Salt. And your flour. I use King Arthur unbleached bread flour. And I also do the initial mix with a silicone spatula. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm gonna turn my scale on. I'm gonna put my bowl on top. Go ahead and tare it. You're gonna start with your active sourdough starter, and I add about 120 grams, anywhere between 100 to 120. I tend to like 120. I think it gives it a little bit more flavor. So I'm gonna add 120 grams of sourdough starter to my bowl. You always wanna make sure that you have a little bit left of your starter so you can go ahead and refeed it. I'm gonna tare the scale again, and then I'm gonna add 350 to 360 grams of water, filtered water. So I've got about 356 grams in there. And then you are going to take either your spatula, I've got a fork here, and I dissolve that starter into the water. You're going to just mix it together until it starts to resemble a kind of milky looking water. Should be pretty smooth. You shouldn't have any clumps left. Then to the water and starter, I'm gonna add my 10 grams of salt. I should have mentioned, this recipe makes one sourdough loaf. So that's what we're gonna get at the end with this. So again, 10 grams of salt. I'm gonna take my spatula and just kind of stir that around, make sure that it is mixed in. And then the last thing is the flour, 500 grams of flour. All right, so now that I've got my flour in there, I'm going to just take my bowl off the scale. So now I'm gonna go ahead and mix everything together. If you've never baked with sourdough, I will tell you it is a very sticky dough, which is why I like to do the initial mix with a spatula. You can definitely get in there with your hands, but I like to just keep it a little bit more nice and neat. The spatula also helps me really kind of scrape down the sides of the bowl so I can get every little bit of every ingredient incorporated. It's gonna come together fairly quickly, but it's going to look shaggy. It's going to look maybe like it doesn't want to combine. It might even look like some of the flour looks a little bit dry. That is absolutely okay. This is your initial mix. So let me clean off my spatula here and I'll give you an up close look. So you can kind of see that dough is looking pretty shaggy, but that is perfectly fine. So now that everything is mixed together, you are either going to take a damp tea towel, or I use a beeswax wrap here, cover your bowl and let it sit for 60 to 90 minutes. Don't touch it, just let it sit for 60 to 90 minutes. This is what they call the Autolyse phase. And what you are doing in this section is allowing the flour to really hydrate with the water in that dough combination. Now, a true Autolyse is just flour and water, but I'll just tell you, I adapt my sourdough recipe to make it a little bit more time friendly for the at-home baker. So I just put all my ingredients in to begin with, and then again, I'm gonna let it sit for 60 to 90 minutes. So I'll come back and show you what it looks like after 60 to 90 minutes. Okay, so it has been about an hour and 40 minutes and my dough mixture has been resting, and now you're gonna move into what are called the stretch and folds or lifts and folds, either way. But you can take a look, the dough has started to kind of relax. It looks a lot more hydrated than it did when we did the initial mixture. So now all you're gonna need is to take some of your filtered water. I have mine in a shallow bowl here, but you're gonna want a little bit of water to keep your hands and fingers wet while you're doing your stretch and folds. So I am just going to dip my fingertips and kind of my hand in that water. And what you're going to do is you're gonna grab one edge of the dough, stretch it or lift it, and then you're gonna fold it over to the other edge. You're gonna rotate your bowl a quarter turn, stretch it, and fold it over. And continue to do that all the way around. You want to make it around the circle or the piece of dough at least once, so at least 4 of these. But you wanna keep going until your dough starts to form a pretty solid round structure. The stretch and folds are actually starting to develop this is what's going to start to develop the gluten in the bread. So what you'll notice as you start to do these is you're gonna start to build some tension back into the dough. So instead of just kind of being a, soggy, kind of gloopy mess, as you do these stretch and folds, the dough is gonna start to become stronger because you're building that gluten structure. So I've gone around and done about 6 or 7 stretch and folds, probably about twice around. And you can see now it's gonna hold its round shape a little bit better. So this is all you're gonna do, and you're gonna do 3 to 4 rounds of stretch and folds or lifts and folds every 30 to 45 minutes. So about the next 2 hours, you're gonna need to kind of hang close by to be able to do these. Once you do your stretches and folds, you're just gonna take your tea towel or your beeswax wrap, place it back on your bowl and leave it on the side. And I just leave my water right next to it. So the other thing that I hear all the time when I talk about making sourdough bread is it sounds very time consuming, and I just don't know that I have the time to fit this into my routine. And what I'll say to that is sourdough definitely is a more lengthy type of bread as opposed to a yeast bread that can be made in a couple of hours. Sourdough really is probably a 1.5 to 2 day process. But what's great about it is the hands-on time is not very much. You're probably spending only a couple hours, 2 at the most, really being hands-on with your dough. The rest of the time is really spent for the dough to do its bulk fermentation, or it might be doing its cold proof in the refrigerator overnight. So it does take a little bit more time, but you're not hands-on for that entire 1.5 days. So there's definitely ways that you can work it into your schedule. So for me, I like to start my sourdough bread in the morning and let it bulk ferment all day, do my shaping that first night, cold proof it overnight, and then bake it the following morning. So today I started my dough at 8 a.m. I will get through my bulk fermentation around anywhere between 4 and 6 p.m. and then it'll go in the fridge for about 12 to 15 hours until I'm ready to bake tomorrow morning. If you are someone who wants to start your dough at night, you can definitely do that. If you're more of a night owl and you tend to be up a little bit later, you can start your dough at night, do your bulk fermentation overnight, cold proof the following day, and then bake your bread right before dinner. So it is pretty flexible, and you can really find a way to work it into your schedule, whatever that may look like. Now, in terms of how long you do each phase, that's really gonna depend on the environment of your kitchen that you are baking in. So if you tend to have a warmer kitchen or your house runs a little bit warmer, your bulk fermentation might finish a little bit sooner versus if it's cooler, your bulk fermentation might finish a little bit later. So I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that stage. But again, right now we've mixed the dough, dough. We've let it Autolyse for about an hour and 20 minutes, and we've done our first round of stretch and folds. So I will be back to show you rounds 2, 3, and 4 over the next little bit of time, and we'll start to see how the dough transforms. Okay, I'm back for my next round of stretch and folds. It's been probably 45, 50 minutes. Don't get so hung up on it being every 30, 45 minutes. You know, somewhere around there is just fine. You can see the dough is starting to see how it kind of moves. It's starting to spread out in the bowl. So again, these stretches and folds are going to help to build the gluten. So I'm gonna wet my hands again, and I'm gonna start going every quarter turn, stretching the dough and folding it over. Stretch it as far as it'll go. You can wiggle it a little bit and then fold it over. And again, what you'll notice is it starts to build tension, and you're gonna get that dough to form a nice ball again. So the other thing that you'll see that starts to happen as you do these is the consistency of the dough. The dough is gonna become much more smooth, much more supple feeling. It's not gonna feel dry or brittle. It's going to feel very well hydrated and just look really nice and shiny and pretty. So you can see now I've got my ball formed again with my dough after doing this set of stretch and folds. So I'll be back to show you what happens after you complete your last set. All right, so now I am going to start my final round of stretch and folds. You may start to notice in your dough at this time that you are starting to see some fermentation bubbles form on the sides or the center. Perfectly fine, totally normal. You're not gonna hurt it by doing the stretch and folds. You wanna see that, and you're gonna see more of it over the next few hours. So as I am completing this final round of stretch and folds, my dough is starting to hold its shape really, really well, and I can see some small fermentation bubbles on the surface. The dough is smooth and shiny and looks really, really nice. So now you're gonna let it bulk ferment. I'm gonna put my beeswax wrap back on top. You wanna keep it covered. Now, the time that your dough takes to bulk ferment is gonna depend on a couple different factors. It's gonna depend on how strong your starter is, but also really the temperature of your house. The warmer your house is, the faster bulk fermentation might complete. The cooler your house is, the longer it might take. So I have a pretty strong starter. My house does run on the cooler side. It's about 70 to 72 degrees. So my bulk fermentation takes about 6 to 8 hours to complete. In the summertime, that reduces a little bit more when my house tends to run a little bit warmer, like 74, 75 degrees. What you are looking for, minimally, I would say bulk fermentation is gonna take about 4 hours. So you can start checking your dough around that point. What you're looking for is the dough to rise about 50 to 75%. You should see some fermentation bubbles. And what you'll notice in your container is the sides of the dough against the side of your bowl or whatever vessel you have it in are going to kind of start to look rounded. So you're looking for rise. It doesn't necessarily need to fully double because it's still going to ferment in the fridge in its next section, but you're looking for it to, again, grow maybe 50 to 75%. You'll see some of those fermentation bubbles, and your dough will start to look like it's kind of pulling away from the sides and creating some rounded edges. So I'll come back and show you what mine looks like when my bulk fermentation is complete and I'm ready to start my shaping. All right, so the dough now has finished its bulk fermentation. It has been 6 hours since I did my last stretch and fold, and you can see it's risen nicely. You can see the bubbles that are starting to form, the fermentation bubbles. So now we're gonna go ahead and I'm gonna do the shape, and I'm gonna place it into my banneton. And the last step is, once we do that shape, it's gonna go in the fridge overnight until we're ready to bake tomorrow morning. So I will zoom you in and show you how to do the shaping for this oval loaf. I'm gonna start by flouring my banneton. I'm just gonna make sure that you've got the sides and the bottom coated with some flour. And then I'm just gonna dump some excess on my work surface. You can do this directly on a countertop, on a cutting board. I'm using the silicone mat. And so again, you can see the dough here, nice and risen. You can see the edges are that rounded edge that I talked about. So I'm gonna go ahead and take this dough out. Just gently remove it from your bowl. And to shape it into this oval shape, I'm going to start by gently flexing the dough. I'm going to take one side and fold it over. The other side, fold it over. And then I'm going to take my end and start to roll it into itself. You don't want to over flour because that's going to give you dry pockets. So now that I've got it in that oval shape, I'm just going to kind of take these ends and tuck them under. And then you just use the sides of your hands to kind of create that nice oval shape. So now I'm going to take my banneton, gently flip my loaf over, and place it in seam side up. Now you want to make sure that you create tension. So I'm going to take these edges and kind of just fold them over on each other as well to continue to create tension on the underside of the loaf. So now that everything is all nice and seamed up, I just add a little bit more flour on top. Cover it with my beeswax wrap, and then this is gonna go in the fridge until we bake tomorrow morning. Okay guys, we made it. It's the second day of our sourdough bread baking, and today we get to officially bake and taste the fruits of our labor. So I have my cast iron Dutch oven preheating in my oven. The oven is set to 475. You want it really hot because you need to create that intense heat and intense steam to help leaven and make the bread rise when it bakes. You also want to make sure when you are baking in cast iron that you preheat your Dutch oven for at least 45 to 60 minutes. So mine has been going for a little over 45 minutes now, and I am ready to bake. So a couple things that I use when I'm getting ready to prepare my dough to go in the oven. So I use a piece of parchment paper. I'm going to use a cutting board to help me easily flip the dough out. I have your bread scoring tool. I think it's called a bread lame, L-A-M-E. They make bunches of different shapes. This is the one I have. And then I use a little pastry brush just to brush off any excess flour. So I've got my dough that I just pulled out of the fridge. So you can see it's risen to the top of the banneton. And now you just want to check to make sure that it is fully proofed. So the way that you can ensure your dough is fully proofed is you're going to give it a gentle poke about a 1/4 inch with your finger. And if that poke continues to rise but not fully rise back up, you are good to go. If you poke it and it doesn't rise at all, it's probably overproofed and you're not gonna get that spring in the oven. And if it springs back too quickly, you probably need to let it proof a little bit longer. So I don't know that you'll be able to see it on here, but if I poke my bread, you can kind of see how it comes back up a little bit. So that's exactly what you're looking for. So I'm gonna take my parchment and put it over my banneton, and then my cutting board right on top. Invert it, and then gently remove the banneton. This is where I use my pastry brush to just kind of brush off any excess flour. You don't want big clumps of flour. You can get fancy with your scoring, which we're gonna do in a second, or you can keep it pretty basic. I tend to be pretty basic, but you do wanna score your dough, because if you don't, when it expands in the oven, it's just going to expand and kind of burst open wherever it pleases, which is also fine if you want that, you know, just super rustic artisan look, but I like it to be a little bit more controlled. So I'm gonna go down the side from end to end and just give it a nice score. About a 1/4 inch to maybe 1/2 inch deep. And that's gonna give me a nice ear. So you can see my score is right along the side there. So the last thing is to transfer it into the Dutch oven. So I'm gonna put it in my Dutch oven and I'm gonna let it bake with the lid on for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, you're going to take the lid off and let it continue to bake for 15 minutes. That's when you're gonna get that beautiful brown and golden crust. But you need the lid on because you need that steam to let it rise when it's in the oven initially. Now, while my bread is baking in the oven, I wanted to share with you a couple different reminders. Sourdough is something that takes practice. It is perfectly okay if every loaf does not turn out perfect. In fact, you should kind of expect it. I cannot tell you how many loaves of sourdough I baked that did not rise the way I wanted them to, and just overall did not turn out correctly. It's really hard to pinpoint exactly how you need to make sourdough because it really is dependent on the environment that your dough is in. It's dependent on your house temperature, it's dependent on your starter, it's dependent on the flour that you use, all of these different factors. And so if you are anything like me, before I started baking sourdough, I went online and started researching everything that I could. And what I'll tell you is every article I read, every video I watched said something a little bit different. And it was really confusing because I was like, why can't there just be like a standard way to do this? But the more I baked with sourdough, the more I started to learn, again, those key things that I was looking for that would tell me I was on the right track. So again, knowing what the dough should look like at the end of your stretch and folds to make sure that you've got that gluten development and everything is nicely incorporated. Knowing what to look for when you're done with bulk fermentation. Knowing what to look for with the poke test when you're about to score your dough before you put it in the oven. These are all things that you're gonna learn with practice. And so I don't think that that's talked about enough. I think everyone's just like, here's how you do it, and you're gonna have this amazing loaf of sourdough bread. Sometimes it just doesn't work out that way, and sometimes there's really no rhyme or reason to it. Sourdough is a wild yeast, it is a living thing, and sometimes it just kind of wants to do its own thing. It doesn't really care what's on your agenda. So don't worry if you're baking and your loaf doesn't turn out perfect. My loaves rarely turn out perfect, and I would rather have an imperfect homemade sourdough loaf than a perfect one filled with all of those preservatives and everything else from the store. So just enjoy the process, and the more you do it, the more you're gonna learn what your bread does in your baking environment. The other thing I'll say is if you are watching this video after watching a lot of sourdough baking videos, you'll notice that my technique isn't perfect. I've only been baking sourdough for about 9 months. And so again, this just comes with more practice. My shaping technique isn't perfect. I'm sure my scoring technique isn't perfect, but hopefully this is relatable. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have 10 years of baking bread under your belt in order to make an amazing loaf of sourdough bread. The whole point is getting in the kitchen, getting your hands into the dough, starting to learn the textures and aromas, and again, just the way the dough is going to look and respond to the environment that you're baking in, and you're gonna learn so much just by doing it. So don't get hung up on the perfect technique or the perfect score or anything like that, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. This is about having fun in the kitchen and baking homemade sourdough bread. That is what it is ultimately all about. So hopefully those last 2 tips are helpful. Again, don't worry if your bread doesn't turn out perfect, just continue to try. And don't worry if you don't have your technique down 100%, because it really doesn't matter a whole ton in the end. So I'll come back after I do my 30-minute bake and I'll show you what it looks like when the lid comes off, and then I'll show you the end result after we get that final 15 minutes with the lid off. All right, guess what? It is officially done. I just pulled it out of the oven. Let's take a peek. How amazing does this look? Beautiful ear on the side there where we made that score mark. Perfectly golden brown. Look at that sourdough. Absolutely beautiful. So once you take your sourdough out of the oven, you are going to transfer it to a cooling rack, just a wire rack, so that it can get some air circulation all around it and start to cool down. This is the hardest part. You really should wait about an hour before you slice in and dig into it, just so that it has time to kind of rest and, you know, really kind of cool down in the way that it needs to. It's really tempting to want to cut into it right away. Let's be honest, if you do cut into it right away, nothing super bad is going to happen. It might deflate a little bit, but it's still going to taste amazing. But if you can resist, let it cool for at least an hour. But there, again, is our sourdough. You might hear that it starts to do some little crackles and things like that. It kind of talks to you when it comes out of the oven. But guys, I cannot even tell you how amazing it smells in here and how amazing this bread smells. Okay, everyone, well, I'm gonna go ahead and let my sourdough cool down before I dig into it, but I hope this video was helpful. I hope it taught you a few tips and tricks, things to look for while you're making sourdough at home so that you can have better success. But remember, it really is just all about practice and doing it and getting in the kitchen and getting your hands dirty and playing around with that sourdough and learning what works best for you and your home kitchen. So again, I am going to eagerly await this bread to cool down so that I can dive right in. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and please subscribe before you leave so you never miss what's going on over at the Barney Homestead. I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye.